In the early months of 1944, as the Pacific War raged on, Japanese officers studying American naval reports often burst into quiet, confident laughter. The reason was simple. The U.S. Navy's destroyers, especially the Fletcher-class ships guarding escort carriers, looked like nothing more than lightly armored tin cans. Compared to Japan's massive battleships and heavy cruisers, these destroyers seemed like toys masquerading as warships. Japanese intelligence summaries described them with clinical certainty. They carried thin hull plating, barely enough to stop machine gun fire. Their 5-inch guns, while fast-firing, were considered no threat to armor thicker than a few inches. And their displacement, little more than 2,000 tons, was laughable when placed beside giants like Yamato, 20 times heavier and armed with guns the size of small railway cannons. To Japanese commanders, especially those of the Center Force under Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, the equation was simple. Destroyers equals fragile, expendable, and harmless. During briefings, officers joked that American tin cans would scatter the moment a real surface fleet appeared. One cruiser captain claimed he could crush 3 destroyers with a single broadside. Another compared them to fishing boats armed with firecrackers. These weren't just insults, they were assumptions built into Japan's strategic thinking. The mocking grew louder after early encounters in the Solomons, where Japanese long-range torpedoes devastated Allied ships. The Type 93 Long Lance was feared across the Pacific, and the Japanese believed no American destroyer could survive, let alone challenge, their surface superiority. They expected future battles to play out the same way. A single Japanese charge sending American screens scattering for safety. By mid-1944, these attitudes hardened into doctrine. When the Japanese Center Force prepared for Operation Shogo and the decisive battle at Leyte Gulf, Kurita's staff reviewed American ship compositions with calm assurance. Their conclusion, the U.S. Taffy Task Units, Taffy 1, Taffy 2, and especially the lightly armed Taffy 3, were little more than speed bumps. The escort carriers were slow, thin-skinned, and poorly defended. And the destroyers protecting them? Just tin cans, laughably small, laughably weak, not worth a moment of fear. One officer later admitted during interrogation, "We believed American destroyers would run. We did not imagine they would attack." Even as the Center Force prepared to steam through the San Bernardino Strait with battleships, cruisers, and destroyers in overwhelming numbers, the mood remained confident. Against such power, the idea that a handful of American tin cans might resist, much less fight, seemed impossible. Yet beneath the Japanese confidence was a fatal blind spot. They underestimated not the destroyer's steel, but the men aboard them. Ships like Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts carried crews who had been hardened by years of relentless Pacific combat. They were fast, disciplined, hungry for a fight, and led by officers who refused to surrender the initiative. The Japanese saw tin cans, but the Americans knew something the enemy didn't. Even a thin-skinned ship becomes a weapon when the crew inside refuses to break. And soon, at Leyte Gulf, the laughter would stop. Before dawn on October 25, 1944, the sea east of Samar trembled under the weight of one of the most powerful naval forces Japan had ever assembled. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's Center Force, scarred but still deadly after a brutal passage through the Sibian Sea, was pushing south with a single purpose: crush the American invasion at Leyte and turn the tide of the Pacific War. The scale of the force was staggering. Leading the formation were 4 battleships, including Yamato and Nagato, each carrying guns capable of smashing a destroyer with a single hit. Following them were 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. More than 20 ships, together representing the largest concentration of naval firepower Japan had left. And they were closing in fast. Hours earlier, American submarines Darter and Dace had attacked Kurita and sunk 2 of his heavy cruisers, including his flagship Atago. Kurita survived, shaken but determined, and transferred his command. Instead of turning back, he pressed forward even harder. His staff interpreted his resolve as proof that this operation was Japan's last great gamble. As dawn crept over Samar, the center force surged out of the San Bernardino Strait like a steel avalanche. Lookouts aboard Japanese cruisers spotted the faint silhouettes of small American escort carriers and their thin destroyer screen, Taffy 3. To Kurida's officers, this sight was almost unbelievable. Escort carriers were never supposed to be alone. They expected to see battleships or fleet carriers nearby. Instead, only 6 slow, defenseless jeep carriers drifted on the waves. A gift from heaven, one officer whispered. Kurita ordered full speed ahead. The battleships lumbered forward, escorted by cruisers eager to open fire. The Japanese believed they were about to slaughter a helpless force and race into Leyte Gulf to annihilate American transports. What the Japanese did not know was that Taffy 3 had almost no warning. Their radar screens had been quiet all night, and the U.S. 7th Fleet believed the San Bernardino Strait was safely guarded. Admiral Halsey's fast carriers had chased a decoy force far to the north, leaving the strait wide open. When Kurita emerged, he found the Americans exposed, unguarded, unaware, and seemingly doomed. On the decks of Japanese cruisers, officers prepared their gunnery crews. The enormous 18-inch guns of Yamato were loaded. Torpedo rooms came alive with activity. The order to engage seemed only seconds away. Yet not everything was calm in the center force. Kurita had lost ships on the way. He had been bombed relentlessly by American aviators, forced to maneuver violently, and his formations had scattered and reformed multiple times. Some captains were confused, some shaken, some deeply unsure if they could withstand another U.S. air assault. But when the small silhouettes ahead came into view, their doubts softened. Thin carriers, tin can destroyers, no battleships, no heavy cruisers. A weak hand forced into battle. Confidence rolled across the Japanese fleet like a rising wind. Officers spoke of easy prey, of a quick battle, of finally striking a blow America would never forget. They believed they held overwhelming superiority. Speed, guns, armor, weight, and doctrine. Kurita raised his binoculars and gave the order that would ignite one of the most desperate naval battles in American history. Open fire. The formidable enemy had arrived, and the ocean between Samar and Leyte was about to explode. The moment the American escort carriers came into view, every man on the small destroyers understood the truth. There was nowhere to run. The Japanese center force, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers was closing in fast, their massive guns already warming up for the kill. The American destroyers, nicknamed tin cans for their thin armor, were the only ships standing between the enemy and the vulnerable carriers of Taffy 3. On the bridge of USS Johnston, Commander Ernest Evans looked across the gray, choppy sea. He could see the towering silhouettes of Japanese battleships, including the giant Yamato, the largest warship on Earth. Evans knew exactly what his orders said: defend the carriers, but avoid decisive action. But there was no way to avoid anything now. If the tin cans didn't fight, the carriers would be wiped out. The battle was coming, whether they were ready or not. Evans grabbed the voice tube and shouted, "All hands, prepare for torpedo attack." There was a moment of stunned silence below deck. Every sailor knew what that meant. Charging directly at ships 10 times their size, hoping to get close enough to fire torpedoes before being blown apart. The engines roared. Johnston lurched forward, accelerating toward the enemy line. Her thin steel hull vibrated as she climbed to flank speed. The crew could now hear the distant thunder of Japanese guns, deep, slow, terrifying booms echoing across the sea. Shells began to fall around them. Huge geysers of water shot skyward. The ship shuddered as fragments rained down on the deck. But still they pushed forward. The tin can was charging straight into the jaws of a fleet built to crush navies. As they closed the distance, Evans ordered smoke. A thick white cloud billowed behind the ship, shielding the carriers from the enemy's view. But the destroyer itself remained exposed, a lone dark shape racing across open water. Inside the cramped gun mounts, sailors strained to keep the 5-inch guns firing. The barrels glowed red, the air vibrating with every blast. Spotters shouted corrections as the shells arced toward the nearest Japanese cruiser. For a fleeting moment, the Americans dared to hope some shots were landing. Then the Japanese returned fire in full force. A massive shell slammed into Johnston's forward hull, shaking the ship violently. Lights flickered. Men were thrown from their feet. Damage control rushed to contain flooding. But Evans didn't slow down. They were close, almost in torpedo range. He yelled, "Left full rudder! Stand by tubes!" The destroyer swung sharply, exposing its torpedo launchers to the enemy. Sailors watched the moment with breathless silence. Then, fire! The torpedoes shot free, racing across the waves toward the Japanese fleet. No one waited to see if they hit. Evans ordered the ship to turn back into the smoke, using it as cover, preparing for another attack run. The gamble had begun. Behind Johnston, the other tin cans, Hull and Heermann, saw Evans's move and understood. One by one, they joined the charge. These fragile ships, never meant for major battles, were attacking the most powerful surface force Japan had left. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and outmatched. But they were not backing down. Their desperate gamble had just turned into one of the most heroic moments in naval history. The Japanese center force had expected fear. They had expected retreat. Instead, they saw something they never imagined. American destroyers charging straight at them, weapons blazing, smoke pouring behind them like furious ghosts. On the bridge of the cruiser Chikuma, Japanese officers stared in disbelief. These tiny ships, thin-skinned, rattling, barely armored, were attacking as if they were battleships. The audacity of it created confusion. Rangefinders scrambled. Gunners hesitated. Officers shouted conflicting orders. The perfect Japanese formation began to fracture. At the center of it all was USS Johnston, wounded but still pressing forward. Commander Ernest Evans stood braced against the storm of enemy fire. Splinters and steel fragments whirled around him. His shirt was soaked with rain, sweat, and smoke, but his voice was steady. "Keep firing. Keep that smoke going." Behind Johnston, Hull and Heermann joined the run, their decks roaring with 5-inch salvos. The sky flickered with fire. Every gun crew worked with frantic speed, knowing every second bought time for the escort carriers to escape. Then it happened. As the destroyers closed the distance, the Japanese line hesitated again. From Yamato to the cruisers on the flanks, captains were forced to slow down, adjust course, and break formation to avoid torpedoes they believed were incoming from all directions. Some pulled hard to port. Others shifted to starboard. The once unstoppable advance became a scattered mess. The Americans could hardly believe their eyes. Evans shouted, "This is it! Press them! Torpedoes away!" A fresh spread of torpedoes launched from the destroyers, streaking toward the enemy. Seconds felt like hours. Then a plume of fire erupted along the hull of the cruiser Chokai. Another blast rocked Chikuma. Alarms wailed across multiple Japanese decks. The tin cans had actually scored hits. For the first time in the battle, the Japanese commanders sensed danger. Not from the carriers, but from the 3 tiny destroyers slashing at their formation like angry wolves. Reports flooded in. Cruiser damaged. Torpedoes sighted. Destroyers closing range. The image of a clean, decisive victory began to crumble. Meanwhile, the American carriers, hidden behind a wall of smoke, used the precious minutes to launch more aircraft. The skies slowly filled with Avengers and Wildcats, forming the second line of defense. But the moment that truly changed everything came when Johnston, already battered and burning, turned yet again into the fight. Evans knew they were nearly out of ammunition, knew the ship was bleeding from multiple wounds, knew that staying alive was no longer realistic. But he also knew one more attack could tip the scales. "Ahead flank," he ordered. "Let's make it count." Johnston roared forward, engines screaming. They charged so close to the Japanese cruisers that sailors could see officers on the enemy decks staring back in shock. The destroyers' guns spat fire at point-blank range, ripping into enemy superstructures. The Japanese, overwhelmed by the sudden aggression, shifted fire yet again, wasting minutes, losing coordination, falling deeper into chaos. The attack didn't destroy the Japanese fleet, but it destroyed their momentum. The advance slowed, then faltered, then collapsed entirely. Confusion turned into hesitation. Hesitation turned into withdrawal. Against all logic, the largest naval guns in the world turned away from the fight. And the reason was simple. 3 battered American destroyers had charged with such ferocity that an entire fleet doubted its own victory. It was the moment the battle changed forever. It was the moment the Japanese advance truly broke. As the smoke cleared over the Philippine Sea, the truth of the battle finally came into focus. The American tin can destroyers had no right to survive that day. They had charged battleships, outrun cruisers, and thrown themselves against guns that could tear them apart with a single hit. Yet somehow, through bravery that bordered on impossible, they stopped the Japanese center force in its tracks. But their victory came at a terrible price. USS Johnston drifted in the water like a wounded animal, its decks torn open, fire still smoldering inside the twisted metal. Commander Ernest Evans, already injured, refused to leave the bridge until the last moment. Survivors later said his final words were simple and calm. "You did good, boys. You did everything you could." Moments later, the ship slipped beneath the waves. Farther north, USS Hull fought until every major gun was silent. Even with engines failing and the ship listing hard to port, its crew kept firing single shells loaded by hand. When the order finally came to abandon ship, many sailors cried. Not from fear, but from frustration that they could no longer fight. USS Heermann, the only destroyer to survive, was barely afloat. Holes gaped along the hull. The bow was twisted upward like a broken jaw. But the crew still cheered because they could see it. The impossible was happening. The Japanese ships were turning away. From Yamato to the cruisers limping in the rear, the entire center force began a slow, uncertain withdrawal. It wasn't a tactical decision. It wasn't strategy. It was doubt, created by the unbelievable ferocity of a handful of small ships that refused to run. Admiral Kurita, standing on the bridge of his flagship, stared at the smoke-covered horizon. Reports of torpedoes, missing cruisers, and relentless American air attacks had convinced him that he was being lured into a massive trap. He didn't know the truth. The carriers behind the destroyers were practically defenseless. But the tin cans had made them look like a full fleet. On the American side, exhausted sailors clung to life rafts, watching the Japanese mastheads shrink into the mist. Some realized what had happened and whispered in disbelief. "We stopped them. We actually stopped them." Hours later, aircraft from the carriers circled the area, searching for survivors. Many men were found burned, bleeding, and covered in oil. But almost every one of them repeated the same message to rescuers. Did we save the carriers? Did we buy enough time? And the answer was yes. Their sacrifice allowed Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, to live. Their attack protected the soldiers landing at Leyte. Their defiance forced the Japanese fleet to retreat at the exact moment when victory seemed guaranteed. In the official Navy records, the battle is called the Battle off Samar. But to the men who were there, it was something far more personal. It was the moment when courage outweighed steel, when determination defeated firepower, when destroyer crews, soaked in seawater and gunpowder, rewrote naval history through sheer will. The tin cans did not win because they were stronger. They won because they were willing to give everything. And that sacrifice, raw, fearless, and unforgettable, is what turned a doomed defense into one of the most unlikely victories in naval warfare.